Okay, so we're going to move to the next session. People watching, give us a moment to switch up the panelists. This morning we talked about the impact of opportunity zones on labor markets, and there have been some commentary from people emailing me like, we need to think about what's the purpose of opportunity zones before we decide whether they're a success, which is certainly true, and I think there are different people have different versions of the intent. But clearly, when you have a capital gains tax break and you have a lot of real estate activity, it's interesting, no matter what the intent of the program is, to look at what's happened to property prices. So we have now 4 papers. Each of the I'm going to beg them to stick to their 15 minutes. And then we have a couple of discussants afterwards. I think I'll just introduce the papers one at a time for efficiency's sake. So the first paper is called Impact of Opportunity Zones on Commercial Investment, Housing, and Economic Activity. The authors are Kevin Corinth and Naomi Feldman, who's at the Hebrew University. And Naomi is going to present.
Okay, wonderful. Everyone can hear me and see my slides? Great. Okay, I will get started. I'm going to jump right into it. Okay, so the big question that we ask in this paper essentially is, are OZs working? So do we see evidence on increased economic activity? In terms of commercial investment, that is prices and transactions, quality changes in restaurants, that is a proxy for general economic improvement. In future work, we're going to be looking a little bit more in housing and foot traffic in local businesses, business openings and closings, and employment. So again, as most of you already know, last year we really expected 2020 to be the year in which OZs would take off. If they were going to take off, Treasury had finalized the rules. December 2019 was the final period to invest and receive the full tax benefits. Of course, now we have to take into account the effects of COVID. It's not quite clear how the pandemic is going to interact with OZ investment. So this is something that we're going to think a little bit more about going forward. Oops, okay. Sorry, I'm just gonna, okay. So why are we focusing on investment? Well, first of all, increased private investment was the direct goal of the legislation. Increased private investment might be a necessary condition to see other impacts, for example, unemployment, resident well-being, poverty, et cetera. We view as all downstream effects that might take longer to observe. And tax incentives were largest for investment in the early period. So if OZs don't increase investment, then tax benefits from OZ investment might have been better invested in other programs to help disadvantage. As we've already heard, CEA estimates 75 billion of capital raised by opportunity funds through 2019 at a federal cost of 11 billion. This represents roughly about 18% of SNAP costs in 2019. So it's not cheap. The first data I'm going to tell you about is commercial investment data. So this is transaction level data from Real Capital Analytics. They have the universe of transactions valued at over 2.5 million from 2010 through 2020. This is a pretty low sort of bar to meet in terms of commercial transactions. We have numerous details on each transaction. I'm not going to make use of those in today's presentation. We're really just going to focus on the number and the dollar amount of investments. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize the summary statistics. And what we know from this data is that selected tracts are more likely to be industrial, lower prices, older buildings compared to other tracts. There are more transactions compared to the census tracts that were eligible and not selected, but about equal to the ineligible tracts. So here is just some data that we plotted, annualized dollars of investments per quarter by tract type. Again, it's probably not surprising. So you can think of this as P times Q. This is representing not only the price of the transactions, but the quantity. Selected tracts were only about 8,700 out of the total. So that's the solid line that we see at the bottom. They have the least amount of total investments compared to the other 2 types of tracts, eligible and not selected, and selected tracts. So as we all know, right, OZ eligibility depended on meeting at least one of the following criteria: official poverty rate of at least 20%, median income below 80% of the median income in the state or metropolitan area, or to be contiguous with a census tract meeting conditions 1 or 2, and have a median income less than 125% of the qualifying census tract. So we're going to use this information to develop an empirical technique. We're going to use multivariate eligibility cutoffs to get essentially an intent to treat, the effect of being eligible as an OZ. And we're also going to use a fuzzy design to get the treatment on the treated, the effect of actually being selected as an OZ. So here we've plotted essentially all of the census tracts in the United States. We have them broken down between being eligible and ineligible. If you focus first on the right-hand side, here you can see that essentially to be ineligible, you had to have a lower poverty rate than 20%, and you had to have a median income above that 80% threshold that I just mentioned. So roughly 100%, or I shouldn't say roughly, 100% of ineligible census tracts fall into this quadrant here. If we move now to the left-hand side, you can see here that this represents all of the eligible tracts. Most of the tracts, or I should say plurality of the tracts, actually qualified on both dimensions. That is, they had poverty rates that were higher than 20%, and they were also below the 80% threshold in terms of median income. 31% only qualified on the median income, and 12% only qualified on the poverty condition. And roughly the 1% here just represents some tracts that are slightly mismeasured in the sense that they use the 2012 to 2016 ACS for their statistics, but I won't go into that right now. So here's what we could think of like the first stage of our estimate. Essentially, this is looking at eligibility, or I should say selection, based upon those criterion that I just showed you. So if we focus first on the left-hand side, these are tracts with a median income below the 80% threshold. So these tracts already qualify based upon their income threshold. So therefore, when you pass the 20% mark, so here this is the normalized 20% poverty threshold, when you pass that threshold, it means nothing because you already qualified based upon the median income. And so here we just plot essentially the probability of being selected, and you could see there's no discontinuity when you pass that threshold. On the other hand, if your tract has a median income above that 80% threshold, when you actually pass that poverty threshold, it does have a very strong probability on being selected. So as you can see here, that if you're below that poverty threshold, right, you're essentially ineligible, but then when you pass it, you become eligible. We could do the flip experiment here using the other threshold. So here, for example, we have tracts with poverty rates above 20%. These are tracts that qualify simply based upon the poverty rate. So therefore, when you pass the income threshold, it means nothing. Again, and this is what we see when we look at the discontinuity. There's nothing special about passing that 80% threshold. On the other hand, if your poverty rate is below 20%, when you pass that median income threshold, it does have a strong probability on being selected. So we're going to take those two regression discontinuity thresholds, we're going to combine them into a two-dimensional RD approach. And you get this graph here, which essentially takes the maximum of those two discontinuity thresholds. And this is essentially what we're going to go with for the rest of this presentation today. We're just going to call this the running variable. But again, this is the combination of those two thresholds such that when you are in the negative range or you're below the zero of this running variable, you are essentially, there's a very much lower probability of being selected. And when you pass this threshold, there's a much higher probability of being selected. So we're going to consider four primary investment related outcomes. The first is we're just going to look at this binary 0-1. Is there any investments? And then number three is the next one I'll focus on. This is the dollar investments. We also do a number of other types of dependent variables. I won't focus on those just in term, just due to the time limitation. So I'll jump here now. So these are essentially the results. So here we're looking at the probability of any investment during the treatment period by the running variable. So again, we saw that there was this treatment. When you pass this zero, right, you go from having a very low probability of being selected to a much higher probability of being selected. But you can see here that when you pass that threshold, it has virtually no impact on the probability of having any investments in the census tract. Here we look at the change in the dollars in investments. So here we're looking at the change from the pre-period, that essentially 18 months leading up to what we consider here the third quarter of 2018 as sort of when OZs would come into effect. And then looking at the 18 months after that. And again, you see virtually no discontinuity in terms of the change in the dollars being invested. So that essentially summarizes most of the results that we're getting here. Is that, passing this continuity, this threshold, when you go from having a low eligibility, or I should say a low probability of being selected to a high probability, you see virtually no impact in these investment outcome variables. So here we show the we show these the two-dimensional RD estimates in the fuzzy approach, where essentially we just we take the RD estimates that we're getting, and we adjust them for the probability of actually being selected. Again, here we have standard errors in the parentheses, and across the board, we're not finding any statistically significant results. I should point out that these point estimates are actually not small. If we look at the millions of dollars of investment, so here we find, $1.8 million investment per census tract. If you multiply that by the number of census tracts, you get something of a magnitude of roughly $15 billion, which is actually quite a large number if you look at just the total amount being invested in selected tracts. So again, it's not that we're estimating a very precise, zero. This is really more of a statement of noisy data having large standard errors that are simply too large to say anything sort of statistically about our results. But again, across the board, we're finding essentially we cannot reject the null hypothesis of no effect. We then moved on to a difference in differences approach, which again, we've already seen a number of other papers take, so I won't explain it too much, but essentially we're just looking at focusing on only eligible tracks and comparing those that were eligible but not selected versus those that were eligible and selected. And so we just want to look again at this change in investment, comparing those two types of tracks. So here we look at some of the pre-trends just to establish those. Here we look at the poverty rates and the median income trends. That you could see that the pre-trends are actually pretty similar for eligible and not selected versus selected in terms of poverty rates, in terms of median income, which again lends some more credibility to our diff results. So here we're looking at trends and various investment outcomes. Again, we'll focus on A and C. This is this binary 0-1. Is there any investment and dollars of investment? And you can see here that it's, again, the data is quite noisy. It's quite lumpy in many cases. And you can see there's a general positive upward trend in terms of having, probability of any investment, also a little bit more in the dollars of investment. Here are the diff results, which again, you could see this, these results really reflect the noisy data. The parallel trends assumption prior to the implementation of OZs is a bit tenuous. And you could see essentially the fact that all of these dots are solid black represents that we cannot reject the null hypothesis of no difference between eligible, not selected, and selected. So again, you could see there's a lot of noise here. We can't say anything, statistically significant. And so essentially we're finding sort of no causal impact of being selected as an OZ. This moves me, I'll say, have a few minutes to say about the second data set that we look at. So here we're looking to see if there's just general improvements in economic activity. In order to say something about this, we're using SafeGraph data. So this is anonymous location data from tens of millions of Americans' cell phones. So here we observe exact establishments that people visit. We're going to use this data for now for a very specific purpose. And we're going to focus on restaurant and other eating establishments. Why? One of the main reasons is that this is the largest category in the data. It represents about 14% of all establishment visits. The next biggest category is religious organizations, roughly about half that number. And out of these restaurants, roughly 30% of them are essentially what we call branded restaurants. These are chains or brand names that you would recognize. So what we're going to do is create what we call a quality index to proxy for economic development. So the basic idea is that we're going to estimate the probability that a restaurant brand is located in ineligible tract during January through June 2018. I would love to go back further or back more in time. Unfortunately, the data only begins in January, so I'm going to just rely on the fact that not too much happened the first half of 2018. And so here the idea is that the higher the probability, the higher the quality. Okay, so if there's a higher probability that you're located in an ineligible tract, we're just going to assume that this is a higher quality type restaurant. So within each census tract, we're going to take these quality measures and weight them by the number of visits. And so this will give us a restaurant quality weighted average for each census tract. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that selected tracts have an average of about 0.5, and eligible tracts have an average of about 0.57, right? So ineligible tracts simply have what we call higher quality restaurants. And so we're going to measure the change in this quality index over time relative to the base period. So how do you get change in this index? Two main ways. The first is that relatively more people go to a pre-existing higher quality restaurant. So people are going less, let's say, to Arby's and more to, Pete's Coffee, or new restaurants open that are of higher than average quality for the census tract, and people go to them. And I should add, I'm using restaurants as sort of a short name, but this essentially also would cover places like Starbucks and other cafes. So here's the distribution of these quality weights. You can see that there's a lot of mass at the 0 and 1. So these are essentially places that really only exist in ineligible tracts. Those would be the ones, versus those that only exist in ineligible tracts, right? So to give you some examples, so these, Blue Bottle Coffee, Chopped Pressed Juicery, these are all types of restaurants that got weights of 1. You could see around the middle, places like McDonald's, for example, a weight of 0.5 is a bit uninformative. If you have, 50% probability of being in an eligible tract, then a 50% probability of being in an ineligible tract. And so we see a lot of chains that just simply are very, exist all throughout the United States, tend to have weights around sort of the mean. So McDonald's, Denny's, KFC. And then we just have a number of places that only exist in the eligible tracts. So when I first saw Pollo Campara, I was like, isn't that the place in Breaking Bad? But actually that was Pollo Hermanos. So in case you were wondering. So here's essentially a change in the restaurant quality index. And again, this is looking at the change from the first half of 2018 through the post sort of opportunity zone designation. And you could see it's essentially another 0, right? So we don't see too much going on here. There isn't that much change in this restaurant quality index thus far.
Naomi, like
so. Yeah, I'll conclude. So just to conclude, so the persistence of economic disadvantage in some areas of the United States, as we already heard, so Ed very eloquently explained this in the beginning, combined with reduced geographic mobility, has led to renewed calls for policies that can improve the economic circumstances of residents in struggling regions. Thus far, we find no evidence that OZ tax incentives has significantly increased commercial investment in selected tracts. We also don't find that in terms of restaurant quality, a proxy for what we consider smaller scale investment and more general economic improvement. We also find no evidence of improvement in this measure. Our results are consistent across RD and difference in difference estimation. And we have some future plans. We want to dig much deeper into the SafeGraph data. We want to look at employment outcomes, new business creation. We're also working with some Zillow data on housing. And we also think that a longer time frame might help us with analysis. So we'll keep doing this over and over for next year or 2 or more.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Very interesting.
Sure.
The next paper is called Where is the Opportunity in Opportunity Zones? It's by Alan Sage of MIT, Mike Langan of the National University of Singapore, where I don't think there are any opportunity zones, or maybe the whole place is an opportunity zone, and Alex Vandeman from the University of Connecticut Business School, who will make the presentation. Alex.
Hi, everyone. So welcome. Luckily, it was already introduced. So yeah, I think this has been a project that we've been working on for a long time. I think the first version we put up was maybe even late 2018 or early 2019. Back then, we thought maybe we shouldn't publish this yet because we might need some more data. And in the end, I'm really happy we did, because we do find that the results changed a little bit after adding the 2019 data, as you'll see as well. And there are some reasons as well. That's why we thought of this up front. So first of all, of course, there's a direct tax benefit. I don't think we have to explain that to you guys. If you're an investor, this is all indeed by commercial real estate investors, the same as the previous paper. I'm actually pretty happy by the previous paper because she already explained a few things for me. So, hopefully I can end up in time because I don't have to go over everything again. At any rate, obviously there's a direct tax benefit, but is there also a benefit broader than that? For the bigger area and not for the guys themselves getting this tax benefit. Or in other words, is this just simply a tax pass through to existing landlords, landowners, or is there actually some value creation? I guess that's sort of the best way to frame the question the way we wanted to frame it. So what do we look at? We look at prices and liquidity. We're going to do the same thing as most authors did, so I'm not really going to go through the methodology in a lot of detail. We're just going to do the same diff and diff setup with propensity score matching. You've heard it a million times. But again, our data is micro data of commercial property transactions. And we're also going to look at liquidity. I'm going to explain a little bit what we mean with liquidity, but liquidity is very important in real estate. There's actually multiple reasons for it. One of it is because price, like the way that information arrives in the commercial property market is extremely slow. We know this. And therefore, we find usually that demand for real estate is a leading indicator. In other words, if there's more demand for real estate than there was before, then prices tend to move up, but also liquidity tends to increase. And actually, liquidity increases first. It's a process of tâtonnement, where you see it in other fields as well. So liquidity goes up, and then the existing owners, they all of a sudden realize, like, hey, wait a second, we could actually have higher reservation prices ourselves. So they might move slower than demand, and therefore you don't immediately see a price increase, but you do see a big jump in liquidity. And this is especially the case in commercial real estate, again, because commercial real estate is extremely heterogeneous, and there's not that many transactions, relatively speaking, so it's very slow, slow information creep there. But of course, second of all, let's say we find no price increase at all. What actually does that tell you? Like, does it tell you it's a success or not? Like, in itself, just talking about prices doesn't tell you the whole story. For example, if we find that we're also going to look at vacant land, for example, I think that's the most clear. Now, for example, we don't find a price increase, but we see a huge increase in liquidity, meaning way more land is being sold than before, then I still think you can argue it's a success, right? Because there's more investment flowing into these areas, and it didn't maybe materialize in prices, but why would it, right? If there's enough land, then it's all going to be reflected into more land sales and not so much in increasing prices. So that's why we're going to look at both prices and liquidity. That's sort of our general story. I guess one of the things we also look at that I don't think other papers did, but I could be wrong, is we also specifically look at young properties versus old properties. And the theory is very simple. It's that young properties, you cannot really benefit from this program. If you just bought a brand new property there, then it's near impossible to do enough CapEx spending in order to qualify for this program. Where for an older property, and especially land, of course, it's actually very easy to qualify for this program, right? So the tax benefit is not for the new properties, even though it's in the same area, and it is for the older property. That already gives us some sort of identification, right? Within these same census tracts, do we find a different effect on new properties than we find on old properties, right? Real quickly, just sort of the theory. Most of you will know what opportunity zones are, but this can help us sort of get a feeling of what the effect would be on prices. Usually, so these are two exactly the same properties, a lot of the same expectations, whatever. The only difference is this one is not in an opportunity zone. This one is in an opportunity zone. If it's not in an opportunity zone, and it's very hypothetical, what would be the investment? What would be the value that you invest here in this property while buying? This is all after tax. It would be like, the sum of the cash flows. Okay, makes sense. It will be the terminal value, the exit value, what you sell the property for in, usually it's 10 years in our case. But also you have to pay over the initial investment. We just say X, a tax rate, which is sort of a flat tax rate. Again, it's very simplified. Why is because we assume here this money comes from somewhere else, right? And this is pure profit. This pure profit coming into real estate, you have to pay tax over this profit equal to the amount of profit that you invested in this property. And also you're going to have to pay some capital gains tax, right? You have to pay capital gains tax, which is the terminal value minus the book value, and you have to discount it as well. Now, I'm aware it's more complex than this in reality. You have your depreciation shields and stuff, but again, this is just to keep it as simple as possible. So what happens if the same property is in opportunity zone? Well, first of all, basically this capital gains tax, we can forget about it. That goes away, right? So that's already nice. We got rid of it. But this term also changes slightly. Why? Because you essentially, depends on when you stepped in. I'm assuming sort of the maximum possible. When you step in, you get like a 15% discount on it, which is already nice. But also you don't have to pay it immediately, right? You can postpone it up until 7 years, if I remember correctly. You can postpone it. That's this TI here. So this is very different already, right? And what you can do is you can subtract them from each other. So what's the difference between OZ and non-OZ? And you get this formula. It's explained in the paper if you don't immediately see it, but you should get something like this. And the assumption there is that the cap rate stays flat, which is not very, it's not a dramatic decision we made there. And then you can just say that the exit value is the same as the initial investment times, the growth in the cash flow. And then once you got this, so the knowns actually are T, because T in real estate is almost always 10 years, which is going to keep it at 10. And the TI is also known, because why wouldn't you try to postpone it as long as you can, which is, again, I thought 7 years. It could be a wrong 1 year there. So actually the only unknowns are the G, which we just simply don't know, and the after-tax discount rate. So we don't know those. But if you sort of simulate them, so we simulate some growth here, and we simulate some discount rate here. Now these are sort of the values that you can get. It was already interesting to see that the growth rate actually doesn't impact, especially if you look in the middle, doesn't impact the premium, the price premium so much. It's mostly the discount rate that matters, actually. Like this is way more lower discount rate, high discount rate. Oh no, this is growth. Sorry, I said it the other way around. So that really matters. So in our case, what we sort of settled on, I think it's about this 16%, where you have like this discount rate of 8% and a growth rate of about 3-4%. I think that's sort of what was typically used in the investment industry. So in other words, we expect if all the money, so this is sort of important to explain, like if everything would go to the pre-existing landowners, if just a tax pass through, then it would mean that the property values would go up 16%. So that's just to give you a feeling of how high these numbers are. Again, I'm not going to explain all the math. It's basically the same as before. We do propensity score matching, just diff and diff. I guess what we might want to explain is indeed we have the microdata, right, the individual transactions, and we do county times year fixed effects. So we're really looking at census tracts within the same county, and we look at census tracts that were eligible and that are that actually got designated. So it's very specific, very local, within a year, within a county. I think that's sort of the important thing. So one thing that we noticed, but I think a lot of you already talked about this, is that, look, if you actually look at the eligible tracts that didn't get designated, you look at the designated tracts, you actually see a huge difference, right? This is the median income, 35,000 or 44,000. This is like as of 2017, I think late 2017. And, you see like a poverty rate, which is way higher. And this was one of the things that really shocked us, is that the average poverty rate in these eligible zones is less than the cutoff is, which doesn't make any sense, right? The cutoff is 20%, but we find that the average is less than 20. And that's, of course, because these zones were made eligible using 2010 data. So you can already see in a way that it's a little bit outdated, right? If the average is less than the cutoff, that doesn't look good. So we do some propensity score matching, which we have over here. And now the data, the census tracts are the same. These, by the way, are census tracts. It's not the individual transactions yet. We go to that in the next step. But yeah, this is sort of what the matching looks like. Well, so again, we also use data for real capital analytics. I actually put a bunch of text here because I wasn't sure if you guys know real capital analytics, and I got a lot of questions about them. I think what's very important to note that hasn't been said before is they have a capture rate of as close to 100% as you can get. They have a team of, I think, like 200, 300 researchers that try to research all the deals. They go through like the deeds, but they also call in, they go through newspapers and, they call people. They need at least 2 people to verify the deal, all those kind of things. And they try to capture close to 100%. And it's really nice because even in non-disclosure states, they get these really high numbers. So a non-disclosure state like Texas, you'll be in trouble if you would just use deed data, for example. But they have almost everything. Again, the only downside is this threshold of 2.5 million. It's not like I'm not sure what the correct word is, but it's not like once it was sold for 2.5 million, it's always in their database. So in other words, if it's sold for 2.5 million and then it's sold for 500,000, it will still be in their database. And also they try to backfill it. So if it's sold for 2.5 million now, they will try to find deals previously. So it's not like really censored in that way. In total, we have like 12,000 transactions between the opportunity zones and the designated tracks only between 2017 and 2019. So we look at the pretty, short bound around this designation process, and we have about 1,100 vacant land observations.
Alex, you got about 4 minutes left.
Yeah, great. This is something, this has to do with age. So what is this? They also have, they don't tell you how much CapEx people are spending, but they tell you, they give like a flag. It was a heavy CapEx spend on this property. And what you can see over here, sort of the age of the properties. In here, the probability, this is just a Kaplan-Meier curve, the probability that this flag will be on. And sort of, we identify this to make age groups. I think we say like 30 years over here, and like 80 years over here. Those are sort of our age categories. We call these new properties, these middle-aged properties, and these are like the older properties. So these are the results. So what do we find? Well, if we look at the prices, first of all, just a dummy for OZ area, I found this interesting myself. It's already negative in the sense that even though we did a propensity score matching, we still find that on average prices are lower in those opportunity zone areas. But then if we look at the OZ designation, which is the thing we're interested in, this is for the young properties, 1 to 30 years, we find no effect. 31 till 80 years, we find no effect. Older properties, we find an effect of like 7%. Vacant land over here, we find an effect, it's a log effect of 32%. If we look at liquidity, I forgot to mention how we measure this, but this is a probability of sale model. So it's a probit model where we just model like 1-0 if it got sold in a certain period of time. And that's, you can read the paper for more details. But we also find, we actually find no effect on liquidity here, but we find a pretty big effect on land sales. So for land, prices went up, but also the liquidity, the probability to sell went up. If we then break it up, into a semi-annual year. So this is saying, look, this is the effect of designation in the first half year, second half year, and then, third, fourth. This is the end of the sample. What's actually interesting, and this puzzled us, but we got some explanation from industry here, is that we find that, again, there's some effect here for the middle-aged properties, as you can see. I didn't highlight them, maybe I should have, but you can see it over here, some effect. But most of the effect, again, is in the older properties, but it's not persistent, like it's not significant anymore at the end. And it also wasn't significant at first. So it seems like they were waiting a bit, then they were positive about it, and now it sort of doesn't, it fizzled out. Now, as the others, we're afraid to add 2020 data, so we didn't do that. We do have the data, though. For the liquidity, you see the same, or for the price on land, you see the same thing. This is, you can see that the price effect sort of fizzled out. If we look at the liquidity, we find that at first, actually, liquidity was negative everywhere, not, of course, significant, but at first was negative, which to us made intuitive sense. It just means that, people didn't exactly know what this program was about. They were sort of, holding their cards. They were, waiting a little bit. But then actually we see later on, we see some severe positive liquidity, including, and this interesting, I didn't highlight this, but this is also something that I'm still scratching my head about the new properties are actually showing up. So the guys that cannot benefit from this program, they haven't seen price increase, but we do find all the way at the end that they did see some liquidity increases. Now, we also did a bunch of robustness. Of course, we don't have time. We looked at what happens if we don't do propensity score matching. We get the same results. We look at, we split the data up by property type. We find it's mostly an office and apartment. We did a major metro, non-major metro. Those are RCA definitions. We find the effect is in both, but the biggest is actually in the non-major metros. By the size of real estate, so whether it was more than 10 million or less than 10 million. And then we find that actually the bigger effect was actually the smaller properties. And we also measure spillover by actually looking just at the eligible zones, but we're actually comparing the properties that are closest to one of those OC designated zones. And then we just say, look, this designation happened in this date at this date, and did the properties that were closest, that were in eligible zones, but not the OC designated zones, but very close to the border of the OC designated zones, do we find a positive price or liquidity effect there? We didn't find anything there. So we didn't find a spillover effect, unfortunately. So quickly, concluding remarks. What do we make of all these results? I'm not going to go through all of this. It's a big back of the envelope anyways, and I don't have the time. But it's sort of in the middle because we do see a price effect. We do see a liquidity effect. But also these price effects are pretty high. They're getting close to what this maximum tax benefit is, but they're not quite there. So I guess it's sort of a nuanced message where we're saying, look, yes, some of the effects, that there might be some value creation there, but to a large extent, it's still like a tax pass through to the existing landowners. It's somewhere in between. So I guess that's it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. The next paper, Do Opportunity Zones Create Opportunities? is by James and Sean Larkin of Tulane, and Trey Drunk Trusper of Amazon, and Sean Larkin will make the presentation. And I guess I got Trey seems to be at Tulane now, so I apologize for that.
Thank you. No, so I'm Sean Larkin. I'm a doctoral candidate at Tulane University. My co-authors are, like I said, James Alm and Dr. Trosper. He's currently at Amazon, but he started working on this project at Tulane University, so that's why it's Tulane Byline.
Thank you.
All right, so I went through a lot of this background initially of what the Opportunity Zone policies are, so I don't spend too much time on them. The main thing I'd like to focus on is that at this point, we can pretty much all agree that OZ nomination was definitely endogenous. It was determined by a variety of economic, demographic, political factors. And that's true in both Frank Hoop's and Lester 2020, Eldar and Garber 2021, and our own forthcoming publication in Public Choice, where we find that it is definitely endogenous. So the summary of this research paper is the main thing we're looking at is, so we know that there's this selection into opportunity zones, but how are they really affecting the targeted low-income communities, right? So what we focus on here is we're looking specifically at Florida, so no other part of the U.S., just the state of Florida, and looking at the real estate prices at the census tract level and with a number of methods. Before I get really too far into the weeds of my analysis, we find kind of two different effects. First of all, when looking at non-vacant residential real estates, there definitely does seem to be there seems to be a small positive effect for opportunity zones. On the other hand, when we're looking at all real estates, we're looking at commercial and non-vacant. Commercial and vacant real estate, the findings become very mixed and inconsistent, especially by methodology. So the data we're using is the Florida housing prices from 2015 to 2020 using the Florida Department of Revenue yearly tax rolls. This is a really great data source because it's basically the entire universe of all real estate transactions in the state of Florida. During this year, so if there's a transaction and that it's on these tax rolls, they don't include any information on the actual. They don't have like number of bedrooms, they don't have square footage, but we do have the whether it's vacant, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial. We know where it's located in absolute geography, so we can match census tracts, and we know the value, of course, and of course everything is in real value. We then combine this individual data and we aggregate it up to the census tract level, right? So we have about 1.4 million transactions that we're looking at, broken up by about 600,000 in the pre-period, in the post-period, and about 800,000 in the pre-period. And about 85% of that is non-vacant residential. So the vast majority of these transactions are in non-vacant real estates. And then we combine this with the demographic and economic information from the most recent American Community Surveys, 5-year census tract estimates, which covers both the pre and the post period. And we use the location of campuses of higher learning from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as one of our controls. Because it does matter if there's a campus of higher learning, like a college campus in the area. So just some summary statistics to give you an idea of what we're looking at. We know that so this is the means, the Q opportunity zones and low-income census tracts. Opportunity zones is a subsample of the overall LICs, and hence the smaller observations, almost exactly a quarter, as you'd expect. In general, opportunity zones have a lower pre-period real estate prices, especially for when you add in the vacants and the commercial real estate, right? You see this huge jump from 271,000 to 619,000. This is, of course, in real dollars, so we're not getting any inflation there. There's also interestingly enough, a lower percentage of the tract is zoned as residential, right? So each tract has a certain percentage of its property zoned as residential or commercial. So only certain that can be used property capabilities for certain things. And OZs tend to be more commercial. Again, population's about the same, and higher percentage of Black and lower percentage of Hispanic opportunity zones. Also, generally lower education. All right. So how do we use this data? We use kind of a variety of methods because we have such a small number of observations overall. Over the census tracts that we're using, we thought that it'd be best to kind of try a variety of methods that we thought were appropriate. So the first one, of course, is in all these methods, we're examining the percent change in the mean real estate transaction value between the pre and the post period. So kind of like a difference in difference, but there's no, it's not a panel component. It's just comparing the pre period and the post period. All right, and because we have very fine data, I'm actually able to pinpoint the month of nomination. So it's a very precise cutoff. So the first thing we do is we run some naive just OLS regressions over all low-income census tracts. And of course, this would be nice. Unfortunately, we know that there is selection. So to try to account for that initial selection, we use both instrumental variables and a fuzzy regression discontinuity design, kind of like what Naomi Feldman did in her paper, although more successfully than we did. The IV that we used is the percent of the tract zoned as residential in 2017, so right the year before the policy took effect. Right, and we think that this is valuable because because we look at percent changes, at any value that the percent of tract zoned residential should already be baked into prices, so we shouldn't see that as percent change. We were mildly concerned about that maybe people were rezoning in response to opportunity zones, but there doesn't seem to be any correlation between being an opportunity zone and changes in percents zoned. And of course, for the fuzzy regression discontinuity design, we used the two cutoffs, right? So we have the income cutoff and the poverty rate cutoff, and because it's a hard cutoff, but there's not a jump, it's a jump in eligibility, not a jump in guaranteed treatment. So fuzzy RD would be ideal, but unfortunately, we just don't have the number of observations to really get a precise estimate. All right, so looking at the OLS results, these are just for everything. This includes vacant, non-vacant, and vacant, non-vacant, commercial, and residential. So this is universally, it's negative, so it doesn't look like there's any. So it's, at first blush, it doesn't look like there's anything really happening here. At best, it's a 10% significance. Windsorizing doesn't affect anything. We Windsorize because there are definitely some tracts that have had very small transactions in the pre-period and then very large transactions in the post-period, often driven by one or two very large commercial transactions. And so Windsorizing kind of was able to cut away some of those very large or very small percent changes. However, when we restrict our sample to only the non-vacant residential real estate, we do see this very kind of a consistent positive coefficients around 0.4, 0.04, 0.03. This is going to be in percent changes. So this is about a 4% change in Model 1, a 3% change in Model 3. Of course, once we Windsorize and we add in controls, we were losing quite a lot of power, right? We don't have that many observations, and so kind of ends up being insignificant at this point.
John, 4-minute warning.
Looking at, thank you. I'll move quickly. So fuzzy RD results. The main reason this is here is to point out that our fuzzy RD results were all very mixed. So regardless of the bandwidth, regardless of anything else, we ended up with these. Our income was always negative and highly insignificant. RD was positive and highly insignificant, and then combining them was negative and still quite insignificant. And it's mainly because we just don't have the sample size to really leverage that. So be careful using fuzzy RD if you don't have the sample size. Using our 2 squares, when we're combining everything and we're using all of our samples, we have these very large our F-stats. The first good thing is that the F-stats are quite large, right? We want an F-stat of at least 10. And even with the controls, we see at about 11, about 12. The second stage results, however, are almost unbelievable, right? These are 87.5% increases in prices, and we know from the summary statistics that the base is around $600,000. So a 175% increase would be basically like almost $1 million on average added, right? That's extreme. and highly unbelievable. So upon Windsorizing, but I think is useful when they're going it together. That kind of goes away, although we still see a very in the fourth fund we add controls, but luckily it's still significance with controls are quite large. Non-vacant residential is the one that I really like to focus on, and that's going to see kind of the F stats are about the same size, but a little bit smaller, mainly because we have lower sample sizes. In this case, I don't think Windsorizing is as critical. So my preferred specification is 2, where we have the controls and we're not Windsorizing. And in that case, the F set is just a hair below 10. And we see about a 7%, 8% increase, but it's also statistically insignificant. The nice thing about this is we did supplement this with control function analysis, right? So it's less robust, but it is more precise. And all the control functions for all results were insignificant. Totally nothing was happening. But for the non-vacant residential sample, it was all positive, significant, and around 7%, which is promising. So in conclusion, evidence is all preliminary, but it looks like that there was this kind of consistent and positive impact on non-vacant residential real estate prices. But when we're looking at commercial and vacant, things just become very mixed, and we really can't determine anything. It kind of depends on whether the methodology you want to use. And then at the end, of course, the main thing is our instrument, I think, is actually pretty promising. So if you have access to that information, it is a good one. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And the final paper in this session is called The Non-Effective Opportunity Zones on Housing Prices by Kevin Chen, Ed Glaeser, and my name's on the paper. I take responsibility for only the words, not the numbers. So if you don't like the numbers, talk to Ed and Kevin. And Kevin's going to comment. Calvin Johnson, I see you have a point to make. We'll get to the discussion after the papers and the discussants have presented. Kevin, floor is yours.
Thanks. Everyone can see the slides, right?
Correct.
Yep, great. So this project is on the effect of opportunity zones on residential housing prices. And so the broad motivation for the project is in economics, we worry about this question of whether the government should be implementing people-based policies or place-based policies. And this just really means that whether the government should help poor people or poor places. So 2 examples of these policies is creating moves to opportunity, which is quite literally paying people to move to higher opportunity areas, versus spending money and resources in subsidizing investment to low opportunity areas, as Opportunity Zone does. And there are good economic arguments against place-based policies, despite them being quite popular with place-based politicians. For example, place-based policies tend to help landowners and might hurt renters, and it certainly distorts migration decisions that are rationally made. And there are, of course, economic arguments for place-based policies as well, which is that they can internalize local externalities, and they might be able to target aid with less distortion. And the question here is whether the Opportunity Zones program accomplishes these things. And we're going to come from the angle of whether buyers of residential real estate expects the Opportunity Zone program to generate sufficient neighborhood change for them to be willing to pay more. So I'm sure I can skip most of the institutional background to this audience. Opportunity zones, the governors nominate them from census tracts, and they provide a variety of tax benefits for investments made in these areas. And the selection is finalized somewhere in mid-2018, which would limit our result to only for the second half of 2018 and 2019, since those are the periods for which we have data. And so there is a caveat that we're looking at a relatively short horizon. And according to the CEA, till the end of 2019, about $75 billion of private capital investment was raised for these zones. And so this project is going to investigate whether Opportunity Zone status had an effect on residential housing prices. And broadly speaking, there are 2 channels where we might expect higher investment to affect housing prices, namely demand and supply. And on the demand side, if we expect investment to result in neighborhood change or higher employment from commercial investment, then we should see housing prices going up. Whereas on the supply side, it is possible that new housing would drive the price down, but it's also possible that the effect is at least somewhat moderated by land prices if existing properties has to be bought up before it can be converted into sort of bigger and taller buildings. And of course, all of the strengths of all of these causal effects would depend on respective elasticities from the demand and supply curves. For example, if the supply curve for housing were perfectly inelastic, the quantity is not going to move at all, and that will turn off any sort of downward price movement. So in this project, we mainly investigate two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is whether the tax credits increase property value for residential properties. And the second hypothesis is whether the tax credits increase property value more so in commercial areas, as this sort of diagram would seem to suggest. So to just give a preview and also related work, on the first hypothesis, whether the tax credits increase property value, we produce a range of treatment effect estimates, which mostly don't reject zero and rule out large effects of more than 1.5 percentage points per annum on price growth. And on the second hypothesis, whether the impact is differential across residential and commercial districts, we find a positive estimate which indicates that the price effect is slightly higher for commercial areas, but this difference is not statistically significant, and so it doesn't really reject zero. And this work is in some sense a response to some previous non-academic work conducted by some private actors like Zillow using proprietary data. And these private sources tend to conclude that home prices increase somewhat massively in opportunity zones, but their inferences are a little bit dubious since they're using not repeated sales price data, which fails to control for quality of the housing being transacted. And it also has more garden variety causal inference issues in terms of their control group and in terms of violations of parallel trends. And relatedly, the CEA also has a report which replicates some of our previous work with only 2018 data. And their estimate of 0.5 percentage points with 2019 data is in the range of our estimates, but it's on the higher end in this range. And so to give you an example, this is what the Zillow report sort of suggests. Their identification strategy is to compare this green line, which is the tract selected to be opportunity zones, against this yellow line, which is the eligible but not selected tracts. And you can see that there is some violations of parallel trend right around here. And the treatment effect that they suggest is also fairly large. The sort of point estimate they would have is about 15 percentage points in housing price growth, which is definitely very large. So to briefly describe the data, our outcome variable is the growth in the FAHFA's housing price index, which is a weighted repeated sales index of single family housing prices. And we're going to separate an analysis for the unit at the census tract level. And because the data coverage at the census tract level isn't terrific, we also conduct a separate zip code level analysis. Whether a tract is an opportunity zone information is going to come from the Urban Institute, and various covariates are going to come from various census sources. And these covariates basically are demographics, economics, and housing-related covariates. And here's the full list. And the results are pretty robust to including all of them, only including a handful, and so forth. So methodology-wise, we're going to conduct a very standard differences in differences estimation. And so to just go through some notation, we're going to let I to denote the unit of analysis and T the time period. And each unit at each time has two potential outcomes for whether they are treated or they're not treated. And of course, they're only treated if they're both an opportunity zone and the time is such that it's after 2018. And the estimate of interest is, again, very standard. It's the average treatment effect on a treated averaged over post periods. And the identification assumption is the standard parallel trends. Sometimes we also use a conditional on X type of parallel trends. And this assumption basically just says that the counterfactual outcome of units that are treated would have the same trend as the outcomes of units that are not treated. So the one thing that can break this is if units somehow anticipate treatment, but there is a relatively short sort of time frame that could happen, and opportunity zones are a little bit of a last minute addition to the bill. And so we don't think that sort of channel is super plausible. So without further ado, let me introduce the results. At the tract level, we're going to use 3 different sort of estimation strategies. And the first strategy is essentially similar to what Zillow is doing, which is to assume that eligible but not selected census tracts are sufficiently similar to the census tract that are selected for parallel trends to hold. And a standard two-way fixed effect estimation would give a point estimate of about 0.4 and a confidence interval that narrowly rejects 0, although it also rejects rather large values like 1. But again, the pretest for whether there is a parallel trend violation rejected, suggesting that maybe there are parallel trends violations going on. The second strategy is essentially the same as strategy 1, but instead of assuming parallel trends holds unconditionally, we're going to control for covariates flexibly using some recent technology developed in the econometrics literature, including using propensity score weighting and a doubly robust estimation method. And both of these are valid and efficient when assuming conditional on X parallel trends hold. But both strategies in the end yield almost identical estimates of 0.3 percentage points of treatment effect, with the confidence interval including 0, and rejects large values like 1 percentage point per year. And the third strategy is to match each treated tract to its nearest untreated geographical neighbor. And once you have these sets of matched pairs, you can then take the within pair difference. And now you just have a time series that you can compare the before against the after. And in this estimation, we get something like 0.6 and 0.5 if you adjust for a linear trend. And again, the confidence interval sort of sometimes rejects 0, but certainly rules out large values like 1.5. So just a picture of the event study plot. And you can see that sort of, if you have to make a bet, you might say that the treatment effect is mildly positive after the cutoff, but you're certainly not going to be super confident in that inference. So again, unfortunately, census tract data coverage is kind of bad, and only half of them are covered by the tract level data. And so to sort of remedy that, we're going to aggregate up and use FHFA's zip code level data for a robustness check. And an additional complication is that zip codes and census tracts are, of course, non-overlapping. And so we have to redefine the treatment as a type of opportunity zone exposure, which is now a continuous variable. And so both estimation and interpretation are somewhat more delicate. And the interpretation of the coefficient is now sort of the treatment effect of opportunity zone designation if the entire zip code is included in an opportunity zone versus none of the zip code is included in one. And we're going to repeat the first two of our strategies. And we're basically going to find that the coefficient estimates are fairly similar, aside from maybe this one. This one gives sort of bigger estimates. But the other two have estimates that both include 0 and rejects large values like 1. And so all of our results certainly rule out effects of more than 1.5 percentage points with 95% confidence. And most specifications rule out things like 0.9 percentage points. So we conclude that the treatment effect is small, if at all, positive. And of course, the caveat is the time horizon of the effects should really be second half of 2018 and all of 2019, which is not a super long time horizon. But there does seem to be little possibility that homebuyers anticipated that inclusion in an opportunity zone would have a dramatic impact on the character of the neighborhood. And this fact does not imply, of course, that the opportunity zone program was a mistake, but rather it is anticipated to have little effect on the neighborhood for buyers to be willing to pay more. So just quickly on our second hypothesis, whether the treatment effect for residential areas is less than the treatment effect for commercial areas, what we're going to do is in a two-way fixed effect estimation, we're going to interact the variable of interest with this sort of residential indicator. And this residential indicator is constructed by splitting on the median of the employee population to residential population ratio in a particular zip code. And we find that, indeed, the point estimates here are negative, which indicates that the treatment effect for residential areas is smaller than that for commercial areas. However, once you include a few or all the covariates, the confidence interval, the effects start to get smaller, and the confidence intervals start to include 0. And so it's not dispositive to say that the hypothesis is true. So in conclusion, point estimates for treatment effects are generally positive, but they're all small in magnitude. These estimates are insufficiently precise to rule out effects of 0, but they are sufficiently precise to rule out truly large positive effects of more than 1 percentage point. And the point estimates for commercial areas are larger than those for residential areas, but the difference is not large enough to reject 0. And that's it.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Well done. So we have 2 discussants, each of whom will have 15 minutes before we turn to our conversation. The first one is Carly-Ann Elizabeth Patrick from Georgia State, and the second is Susan Wachter from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. Carly-Ann, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about these papers. So let's see. Can we see my screen? Well,
Dan, thank you.
All right, great. So I'm discussing the first 2 papers because they were both about commercial real estate, and then Susan's going to tackle the home price issue because we sort of wanted to think about them a little bit separately. So if we want to think about the effects on commercial real estate investment that we see in these 2 papers, we've got the Corinth and Fellman paper, and they use a strategy we've seen a lot, difference in difference with eligible but not selected. They also use RD as well as fuzzy RD using the eligibility criteria. To get their estimates, they've got 2010 to 2020 RCA data, which they mentioned only includes the 2.5 million plus transactions, as well as the SafeGraph cell phone data. And what do they find? No real effects on investments, whether we're measuring that by dollars or numbers, particularly when they normalize it by the amount of investment activity that's taking place outside. And she didn't really talk about that much in her presentation, but I thought that was important. And maybe there's some change in restaurant activity, but didn't seem like that was very large either. And then we've got the Sage, Langen, and Van de Min paper. They're using difference in difference with propensity score matched eligible but not selected. And this is particularly important because they're going to be using data on 2017 to 2019 commercial property transactions. So the only opportunity zones in their sample are those where they actually observe a transaction. And so you can't just use the whole set like we've seen in some of the others. Plus, there are other reasons we've seen that we might want to use the propensity score matching. The other thing to note about their papers, they're using an earlier treatment date. So they're essentially having treatments start in the first quarter of 2018 or the first half of 2018, where we're not seeing all of the designations having been made yet. In fact, part of that, we're not seeing any designations being made. So there's a little bit of difference there. But they find no general price or liquidity effects, but they do find these price increases for older properties and land that are somewhat what we would expect to be the size of the largest tax benefits. And they see a pretty substantial increase in the probability of land sales. So I think we could sort of pick at particular or quibble with particular parts of the identification strategy and pre-trends. But if we take both of these as true and what they found is true, I wanted to sort of think through, do they coincide with each other? Do they make sense together? And is it what I would have expected if I thought of a simple model of commercial real estate? So I decided to think of a simple model of commercial real estate and thought about splitting it into 2 related markets, a market for finished space where we've got end users and we've got our landlords and owners, and a market for redevelopment or investment where we've got the demand side being driven by these investors or developers, and then we've got our owners of existent vacant properties or properties with redevelopment potential. And how would I expect the OZ to affect this? So the first way I would expect it is if we focused on the market for finished space, if there was some expectation that there would be an increase in demand for finished space, then I would expect a price increase. And what could be driving this expectation about future increases in demand for finished space? Well, maybe it's the OZ. It's a little bit unclear what the precise mechanism there would be, but maybe that's what it is. Maybe it is that there's pre-existing trends in the area, and maybe it's some combination of both. And we've seen some reasons thus far to be worried about these pre-existing trends in the area. But what I think is particularly interesting to focus on is a paper that's not in the conference today, but also is looking at OZ designations. And they find what little investment effect they find is being driven by approximately a third of the designees that had strong previous investment activity. And so if there was an expectation, we might be worried that it's really like this small subset, but it could be. We already saw some evidence that they were already improving. So maybe that's it. But maybe there's something else going on. So then on the supply side, how would we expect that increase in demand to be met? Well, through redeveloped spaces and new construction, that's going to link it to the redevelopment market. But we can also think of the OZ as changing the price or the rate of return that's necessary to induce redevelopment. In other words, we could think of it actually changing the slope of this supply curve or the elasticity of supply in this area. But that's not going to be the case if the tax benefits are fully capitalized, right, into the redevelopment prices. So maybe we're seeing some shift. But either way, in the finished market, the change in price is going to depend on future expectations about demand and the elasticity of supply and perhaps the change in the elasticity of supply. So, well, what if there's no expectation of an increase in demand? Like if people don't think this is going to happen, then we wouldn't expect to see an increase in price. And there's some evidence from Corinth and Feldman that there wasn't much of an effect. I think we'd like to see some of that supplemented with all the restaurant visits, just so that we can see if any activity picked up. But we might not expect it. Or if we had an increase in demand, but it was pretty small, or an expectation of an increase in demand, but it was really small, and we flattened out this curve, this supply curve, then maybe we wouldn't expect to see much effect on prices either. And this seems pretty in line with the Sage et al. Paper, where they don't find in the overall market price and liquidity effects. But the opportunity zone was really supposed to hit this redevelopment market, like they said, right? So it really is supposed to affect investors and developers. And so the idea is that the opportunity zone is going to increase demand in this redevelopment market. We're going to see an increase in price and quantity that we could measure in any number of ways, right? And the Sage et al. Paper is going to argue that we should really see this outward push in demand until the price increase is equal to the expected tax benefits, right? But again, this is really going to depend on the supply elasticity. So if I think of a place where there are strict regulations, there's not much available land, there are not very many old buildings, then I might expect to see a big price change and not much happening on the quantity side. My prior would have been to think these are places that have suffered from disinvestment. So we should have plenty of developable land. We should have available buildings for redevelopment, but that might not be the case, in which case we wouldn't expect to see much of a price change and we'd see this quantity change, right? So this leads me to wonder, do we see this these places with very little developable land, very few old buildings, strict regulations, is describing the market of buildings that are really old? I mean, we know there aren't a whole lot of them and that they aren't going to be making more buildings that are 120 years old. Does it also describe metro supply? Is that what's sort of driving these results? Because you're not seeing much in quantity. And what's going on with vacant land supply? Because we see these fairly big price and liquidity effects. So I think what would really help us is if we understood more about what's going on in the supply side in these submarkets, and the analysis where you do give some of the descriptives gives us for the whole sample, but when we break up the analysis by age group, you're getting sales in different sets of enterprise zones and control, or I'm sorry, opportunity zones and control areas. So your sample's sort of changing throughout. So it'd be nice not only to understand for the whole sample, but for each sample, how much vacant land is there, particularly the zoned commercial? What is the age share of commercial property along these different subsamples? What are the commercial vacancy rates? How do OZs stack up against things like the Wharton regulatory indices? So we could get some sense of what supply elasticities look like, and so what effects we might expect. And then there's this moment where I went, Corinth and Fellman said there was no increase in investment. Well, they're looking at all investments, right? So they've got the 2/3 of the OZs that don't have any transactions whatsoever in their sample. So maybe that's it. But then I thought, maybe we don't really need an increase in overall investment for Sage et al. To make sense in this framework. And we don't if some of the investment is being redirected from newer properties to properties with redevelopment or development potential. And so what's the evidence that might be happening? Well, what about the evidence it's being redirected from within the same OZ? This is certainly consistent with what Corinth and Fellman find. You wouldn't see an aggregate increase in investment activity. You would just see it in different places. And so the Sage et al. Paper gives us some evidence that this might be the case. They're negative, albeit usually insignificant, although not always, price and liquidity effects for younger properties in the samples. The samples are changing, so again, it's hard to think about this. There are some negative liquidity effects for industrial and metro properties. So again, there's some indication this might be happening, but I feel like there's more that could be done on this margin. And I feel like perhaps the Feldman paper could push the data a little bit more in order to get at some of this same question. Then I have to ask myself a question that Tim Bartik asked earlier. What if it's net new to the area, but it's redirected from other potentially also disadvantaged places? And there is some evidence that this might be occurring in the Sage et al. Paper, because if we were to increase or interpret the increase in probability of selling that occurs with distance from the OZ as instead a decrease in the probability of selling as one gets closer, then it suggests that we're simply moving investment across the border. And that would be consistent with what Hansen and Rowland find with regards to enterprise zones. And so I think both papers could possibly push a little harder on that. And I'm almost out of time, but I'm almost done, so that's good. I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in these papers. But I think what we really want to know and really want to push a little bit further on is the heterogeneity. How do the effects differ for different kinds of places? So I've kind of hammered home this supply elasticity thing. I think we want to know that. But I also think we want to look at the previous investment activity and how what you're finding varies from places that were not seeing previous investment activity versus places that were seeing previous investment activity, even if on average they look okay as pooled samples. And that would be it. Thank you very much. I've got specifics I'll share with authors separately, but thank you again. The papers were really good.
Thank you so much. That was a very good discussion. And now I'm really pleased that Susan Wachter has joined us to discuss the residential real estate papers. And I understand my colleague, Stephanie Sensula, will handle the slides for that one. So Stephanie, can you make that work?
Yes, I can. It wasn't positive, but looks like we're in business now.
Oh, great. Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it. And I thank you all for inviting me to this session. And I'm commenting on two papers, the two papers that deal with residential prices. So next slide, please. So we have had a long history of economic place-based policy, and empowerment zones and new market tax credits went before OZs, and with mixed results, although more recent literature is finding some results. But OZs are different. They're different in the degree, extent of their tax subsidies. These carefully done studies, both of them, will clearly add to the literature with specific contributions on pricing effects. And the reason why it's particularly important is that these deep tax subsidies could actually prevent any impact at all in terms of development in policy, place-based development policy. And the controversy was early on that opportunity zone prices might rise due to tax advantages, capitalizing all the tax advantages, so that only owners and early investors would benefit. So, in fact, early Zillow data showed that house prices did increase in half more than the national price increase of opportunity zones, and they increased at least, were positive in 2/3. And of course, that's completely raw data. So the question is that both these papers address is whether, if you put in all the controls, and they control it every way, whether you will still find a price increase. And next slide, please. So the goal is that we don't want prices to increase so much as to eviscerate any tax benefit going forward. So it's necessary but not sufficient that tax advantages do not result in price increases that absorb all value gains. But on the other hand, if without any price gains, what's the evidence that the opportunity zone designation has had any impact? The papers will attempt to identify whether ceteris paribus prices rose with the opportunity zone designation, of course, with the major empirical problem that the selection process itself will have perhaps qualified promising neighborhoods, those neighborhoods which are likely to see price increases. So the purpose of these papers essentially is to endogenize the selection process to determine whether there is any price impact or whether there is a large price impact. Next slide, please. So what are the different scenarios in terms of price increases? So one possibility is that prices increase without new development. That is, it's all been capitalized away by the tax advantage. And a second is a much more positive, that we see price increases with new development, and that really is the purpose. That's the policy place-based is attempting to get to. So there's a kind of a Goldilocks price increase, not too high, but high enough to indicate that there is evidence that there is some impact. It's also possible that prices do not increase because no new development is occurring. Or finally, prices also, again, do not increase or in fact decrease because it's working and new housing supply is forthcoming. Remember, we're looking at residential house prices. So we've got lots of possibilities here, prices increasing with no good effect or prices decreasing with good effect. What do we see? What does the evidence bring forth? Next slide. So first of all, on the paper that Chen et al. Presented, they compare single-family price growth within and across opportunity zones. And basically, they are hypothesizing that it reflects buyers' belief. Any impact would reflect buyers' belief or non-belief in the ability of the program to generate neighborhood change. They use nationwide data, and to get to their conclusions, they find little impact of prices, price increases that rule out major increases and rule in zero increases. But they do find, and they emphasize this more in the paper than it was emphasized in the presentation, although it was discussed, that price increases are more likely in commercial areas than residential. That is, residential areas are likely to see more of a decline, if anything. And they hypothesize that that's due to potential increase in supply. So let's turn now to the et al. Paper. And this paper is just for Florida. They find that the OZ designation has little impact in general, but surprisingly for residential, there's a positive impact for residential areas. Next slide. So let's go now into more detail. The Chen paper is showing a less than 1% increase 2018 to 2019, and they rule out a 1.5% or greater, and the results are really robust. These non-results are really convincing. Many different time-varying ways and treatments of covariates. And they do, however, find some heterogeneity, and this to me is the most interesting part of their paper. They split the zip codes in half based on the level of employment to residential population and interact that with a treatment variable. And they find that prices grew more in OZs, that residential prices grew more in commercial areas, significantly more in the paper, although once they did controls, the effect does diminish, than in residential. And the difference in treatment effect is not significant, as I just said, when track variates are controlled and time varying are considered. Nonetheless, there's hints here that the effect is stronger in or weaker in the more residential opportunity zones. And they take that as an indication, and I think that actually the implication is, they are right with this, that more residential opportunity zones, if perhaps buyers are seeing through to supply effects. So it's not impossible. That's a hypothesis that's not that is consistent with this outcome. Next slide. Some suggestions for this paper. The main result and the main purpose of the paper, and in this they, I think, succeed tremendously, is to rule out the Zillow findings, which were weakly controlled for, to rule out the large effects that the Zillow findings of large positive effects. So they do show that selection bias has to be carefully dealt with, and they do carefully deal with it. And when they do, they find very, very small effects, although positive effects. So there's also missing data, which could be part of the problems here. And they also, when they cluster, there are errors. So there are specific issues, and also time horizon is short, specific identification issues. None of these are quibbles. None of them are that important. The overall finding that the Zillow large price impact can be attributed to OZ designation doesn't hold. To me, the most interesting result beside that is the one that I emphasized before, that residential areas price rise less than commercial. They interpret it as supply effects, and that may indeed be the case. Next slide. Now, the findings are more puzzling. First of all, the non-puzzling part of it, which is that once again, all different ways, many different ways of controlling for selection bias, and they all come out with the same conclusion that the effect is small. However, and so I'm not going to go through each one of these. Next slide. So they conclude that the OZ designation has little impact, but they also examine the sample by whether the properties are vacant or residential. And again, they have consistent results, and the consistent results are consistent also within the paper and also with the results we just heard from the Chen paper, that weak evidence of growth being significant, and no evidence that the opportunity zone has had a significant or major impact on real estate prices. So it all seems consistent with the one exception. I think I have this on my next slide. Go ahead, please. They state, and they emphasize in the presentation, that there are no effects, or very minimal effects. But they do have in the paper that the opportunity zone has had a positive effect on non-vacant residential area property. So this is a bit of a puzzle. It kind of contradicts the paper, not directly, because you could find some interpretations, but you'd have to kind of contort yourself to find explanation consistent in the Chen paper, Chen et al., and the et al. Paper. Nonetheless, looking at these papers, next slide, please. So I just want to note that the paper itself states little impact on either residential or business real estate prices, but the findings are really more modulated than that. And the weak evidence that overall real estate prices have in fact grown at a slightly slower rate overall. But again, there is this slight residential effect. Next slide. So to get to the bottom line and to perhaps contort these things together, let's note that this paper is also a heroic empirical paper. It's all for the entire state of Florida, as is Chen is a heroic empirical paper. They both are. But indeed, the paper, the paper is for Florida. So maybe Florida is different. Maybe actually there's a demand for residential in Florida that this paper is picking up. And that's not necessarily then inconsistent with some increase in residential supply that for the nation as a whole is expected to actually decrease. So actually decrease prices in residential. And it's not inconsistent either with Carly Ann's presentation, which I thought was terrific. And also what I think was the most interesting and perhaps strongest finding of all the presentations, which is that vacant land, older properties and vacant land prices are up. So one can tell the story that maybe there are some conclusions using the opportunity zone data for broader issues of policy. And the major policy issue that is out there today that is being addressed backwards and forwards is gentrification and the both positive and negative price effects that come with gentrification. And for my mind, paper by my colleague Jesse Hanbury and others on this is really terrific. I recommend it to you if you haven't seen it. And it shows that, yes, increases in gentrifications come along with increases in housing supply in areas that are similar to opportunity zone areas. And it actually harms low-income renters due to higher rents. But higher rents are coming along with increasing housing supply, which mitigates these losses and actually creates benefits for middle-income renters. So their model is based on calibrated model and counterfactuals. Another article I recommend, Asquith Maston Reed, supports this and shows the local effects of market rate housing developments in low-income areas to be basically the same, that somewhat higher rents, but also higher supply. New construction may slow rent increases associated with gentrification is where this literature is going, if I understand it correctly. Now, what about the opportunity zone papers that we've heard today and the ones that I have looked at? Very, very mixed with not strong effects, which is good on some level because that means that there is room to have developer profits. It's not all in the land. And that construction activity in the longer run may very well occur and may very well bring in new supply and at the same time, new quality of life. So the opportunity zone policies, which I initially came into this conference thinking that this is a very rich set of subsidies, who knows what kind of good, if any. Having read these papers make me think that let's wait, let's see the construction activity and join it with this price data and extend the price data, and let's wait for these conclusions. But these papers themselves will certainly contribute to eventual conclusions. So thank you for the invitation to discuss.
Thank you very much, Susan and Carly-Ann, for very good discussions. Here's what I propose to do. We're going to bring everybody who's in the Zoom room into the room so they can participate. I'd like to start with any comments that people have on the 4 papers we've just heard, and then we'll have a little time at the end for broader things. There's one question. Dawn Bidney asks, says the following in the chat: these studies generally treat all OZ tracts the same, with some controls for observable characteristics, but actually investment under the OZ program would tend to come in chunks and would not be distributed smoothly across the zones. So when you think about going forward, how would you design studies differently if, and I hope when, we get data on where OZ investments have been made, and what are there implications for this lumpiness of investment for your current research design? If that appeals to anybody, I'm happy to take a response to that. If not, we can see who else.
I think that's more a question for the investment papers than for the price papers, right? Sure. Although obviously, if we knew where the investment was, it would be nice to link the investment to the price growth. I mean, that would be a cool thing to do in some way.
Right, right. Any other comments on the real estate papers? If not, I want to ask if the authors want to, any of the authors want to respond. We can do that.
Oh, I just very much want to thank Susan for her excellent comments. That's my only response.
Okay, that's good. Good response. Naomi or Kevin, do you have anything you want to say?
Sure. No. Thank you. Thank you so much for those comments. I totally agree that looking at heterogeneity would be an excellent idea. This is sort of our first pass. It's just really looking at aggregate investment. I think there's really a lot more work to do. The data is really cool, so we definitely want to dig in a little bit more, and it's a great suggestion. So thank you.
Kevin Corinth, if you want to, anything?
Nope, nothing else.
Good. Alan Sage, Mike Langen, or Alex Vandeman?
Oh, the same. I want to thank everyone for the very helpful comments. We'll see what we can do.
Great. Sean and company?
No, thank you so much for the great comments. I really found the breaking of the scenarios really helpful. So I really hope to be able to kind of incorporate that into future analysis.
Good. And Kevin or Ed, do you want to, Kevin, John or Ed, do you want to add anything?
Kevin, do you want to add anything on?
No, I also want to thank the comments. They were very helpful.
Kevin, are you in San Francisco or in Boston? What, are you?
I'm in Boston.
Yeah. You're just trying to fool us, or taking advantage of the canned Zoom screen? You know that Calvin Johnson, who's on the call, wanted to make a point. Calvin, if you're with us, are you with us? If so, the floor is yours. I saw him a minute ago, so I thought he was here. Okay.
There we go. Thank you. I'm now unmuted. Thank you, David. I would think that repeal of the ozones would be an extraordinarily good target in the coming years. We're having extraordinary spread in the holding of wealth, a lot more inequity than we ever had historically. And at some point, we're going to have to do something about the deficits. It's extraordinarily hard to develop good ways to reach wealth, or at least reach rich people. They defend themselves very well. And one of the simplest ways to do it is simply repeal ozones. You can do that with a stroke of a pen and it's all gone, and you raise a lot of revenue. And you also get rid of a project that is doing a lot of harm. Everyone more or less is celebrating the increase in fair market value of residential real estate, or at least land. And that means increase in fair market value on the fundamentals means that the rents are going up. Cash flow is going up, either in the past or projected to go up. And these are rents being paid by the poorest of the poor. These ozones are identifying poor people paying rent. And the last thing in the world you want to do is increase your rent. If your results had been there was savage decreases in the fair market value because the rents had dropped so much, well, then there would be a time to celebrate ozones and say, you know, people are getting their returns from the tax benefits and not from the net present value. But that's not what you're finding. At very minimum, there's a weak effect of doing real harm to poor people. And if there is any group of people who these panelists need to serve, it is, in fact, the poorest of the poor. So that's right on the top of my list. There's some other things, but right on my top of my list of repeal.
Okay, thank you for that. Ed Glaeser, I wonder if I could just ask you for a minute. If you look at all the work we have so far based on data available, I really have two questions. One is it too soon to draw any conclusions given the amount of time that opportunity zones have been around and of course the COVID thing? Or would you at something like this expect to see early signs of this in things like housing and commercial construction and costs and so forth? And secondly, if you were coming up with research questions for a bunch of talented people like we have on this call in the future, what would be one or two things on your list?
Both great questions. I think we do have at least, I mean, and it's been an amazing day, David, and thank you for organizing this. I think we have a fair amount of evidence that these things have relatively muted impacts, at least given what we've seen so far. I think if I were inclined to be a diehard opportunity zone defender, which I am not, but if I were, you could still claim that, you know, something will still happen for some reason or other. The home prices are not properly reflecting expectations, or they're muted because of expectations of future supply that will overwhelm things and actually achieve what Calvin is hoping to achieve, which is pushing down prices. But you know, it's a possible stance to take, but I think it's a hard one to really argue with a straight face. I think the more interesting question is, what have we learned from opportunity zones going forward? I mean, I would not be surprised to see this particular exercise into placemaking disappear in the Biden administration, but I am confident that there will be something else, right? That I am confident that whether or not it occurs through the tax code or through spending or for infrastructure, it's coming down the track. And so we need to understand what forms of these types of placemaking exercises are least likely to be harmful or most likely to be helpful, and to try and glean those lessons from the Opportunity Zones episode that actually helps us to understand that. At least that's at least would be my take on this, is focusing on this. Now, what does that actually mean? I've never been in the business of second guessing other people's research agendas, but I think the more that we can understand how this actually impacts life on the ground for people who are impacted by these things, the better off we are. And the more that we can actually understand, what happened to the people who lived in the area originally rather than people who moved in, that's also sort of a crucial thing. So things that involve panels that are based on where people live, I think that's incredibly helpful.
Great. I think that's a wonderful closing benediction. I don't want to cut off discussion, but it's been a very long day. So I feel like an auctioneer saying going, going, going. I really want to thank, first I want to thank everybody who participated. People were extremely timely and efficient in their presentations and getting us the slides. I think we learned a lot, even if we don't come to any bottom lines. I'm pretty much convinced that bringing people together who are working on similar questions, maybe with different methods or different data, is the only way we can come to consensus on what we've actually learned so far. And as I've said repeatedly, I looked at all these papers as a template for drawing further conclusions when we get more data. I want to particularly thank my colleague, Stephanie Sensula. I don't know how many rings this circus had, but it was more than 3. And we're learning a lot about conferences on Zoom. One of them is that you can get a lot of people together who would never be able to get together in a physical space in Washington, D.C. And just as a personal note, there are a lot of people on this call who have taught me a lot about opportunity zones, and I look forward to learning more about them, and I appreciate them all. So with that, thank you, have a good day, and stay safe.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.